Hey guys, Miss Osuna here. Let's do our shirt jack. So we're going to start off with the center front. You want to make sure your pieces are fused and overlock your center front edges both on the left and the right. So let's get started doing that. Up next, we're going to sew at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So making sure that you press really well. The center front edges get pressed under and sewn at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat for the other side. Now on to the patch pockets. We are going to sew our patch pocket and our lining together. We're going to sew them together at the very top edge, line up your notches, and you are leaving the center open. So we're sewing on the left and the right side. Make sure they are face to face, and you're sewing this at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. press that seam open. And now we are going to line up the bottom edges together and sew around the left, the bottom, and the right. Trim it so that you can flip it right side out, and you're flipping it through that center opening. Make sure you push the edges out nice and straight. We are going to do a slip stitch with a hand sewing needle just to close that center opening, and the slip stitch is going to only be on the seam allowances, so you won't see it on the outside or on the inside. So you're just grabbing the seam allowance from the lining and grabbing the seam allowance from the self, and just barely pick up a tiny little bit at a time. So after you finish your slip stitch, make sure that knot is in place and you won't see any of the slip stitch at all. Then you want to press, and we're going to sew our pocket to our shirt front. So we are sewing right at the edge, a 1/16 of an inch away. You could even get away with an 1/8 of an inch away. Just make sure you cover up those drill holes. Everything is lined up in place, and we do not want to see any of the lining when we are done sewing. So make sure that you pressed it well so the lining is on the inside and so that the self is all we see. We don't want any of that lining fabric to peek through once it's sewn to our pocket. So notice how I am placing it so that the lining is not going to show. Then we're going to move on to our collar. All right, notice for the collar that the top collar has fusing, the bottom collar does not. The top collar is larger and the bottom collar is smaller. The only place the collar will line up is at the neckline edge. So that's the bottom rounded edge, and that's where we're gonna line everything up to start. You're gonna sew the left side and then the far right side, then we'll go across the top. Okay, we're going to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance for our collar. Make sure you stretch the bottom collar so that it meets the top collar across the top. So our bottom edges line up at the neckline, that's the rounded edge, and now you'll have to gently pull that bottom collar so that it comes all the way up to the top edge. It's only about an 1/8 of an inch shy, and that's so that the top collar will be bigger by an 1/8 of an inch. That's intentional. And then now we repeat this whole entire process for the opposite side. Again, they line up at the neckline edge, which is the rounded edge. And so you'll have to stretch a tiny little bit to make sure it reaches to the top edge. Backstitch at the beginning and end, 1/4 inch seam allowance. And now it's time for us to sew the top. So remember that rounded edge is your neckline. That's at our bottom. That sits on the shoulders and goes around the body. And your top of the collar, make sure that you stretch it gently so that it matches. It's only, again, about 1/8 of an inch shy. So you don't have to stretch too much, but do make sure that you stretch, because the whole point is that the top collar will fold around. It's going to encase the bottom collar, and we don't want to see any of that bottom collar showing through. So lining everything up at the top edge here, knowing that the top edge is straight and your neckline is that rounded edge, but the top edge is straight. And notice how I'm pulling and stretching it just a tiny bit to keep it even, so that way when I flip it right side out, the top collar will be completely bigger and the under collar or the bottom collar will be a little bit smaller by 1/8 of an inch. Make sure you backstitch at the beginning and end, and again, 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once we finish sewing across the top, you want to trim diagonally just to reduce some of that bulk, and then it's going to be time to understitch. Our understitching is on the bottom collar, so the seam allowance goes toward the bottom collar. That bottom collar has no fusing, and we are just going to stitch 1/8 of an inch away. So seam allowance gets pressed toward the bottom collar and understitch to keep everything in place 1/8 of an inch away, and that will be it for your collar as far as putting it all together. As you get close to finishing, you're not going to get all the way across. Just make sure you backstitch, because we don't want any of our stitches to come out. Then the next thing we're going to do is flip it right side out and press. Now that we have our collar assembled and it's all pressed, we're gonna close our neckline so that nothing is flopping around when we attach it to our shirt jacket. So lining everything up at the rounded edge on your neckline, and sew this at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. We're just stay stitching this closed. That is it for part 1 of our shirt jack, which is just a shirt jacket combination. And I will see you in class and in the next video where we will do part 2.